Hebrews chapter 10, where you hopefully will be looking at the first 18 verses. And sometimes when we are going through the book of Hebrews, it begins to sound a little repetitive. And as we go through this, remember that he is building, the way he teaches is that he presents the truth. He presents it, and he builds this case, and then he applies it, and then he transitions to the next part. But it's a building block kind of book where it's built on one truth after another, after another, after another. And so this is such an essential truth that we've been looking at. And remember who he's talking to. He's talking to Hebrew Christians, people who understood the sacrifices and their meaning, and when and where, and the feast days, and the priest, and the high priest, and the Day of Atonement, and the daily sacrifices that they had to make, the daily cleansing ceremonies they had to go through. This was all part of their lives. And so when Jesus came, they believed that he was the Messiah. He presented himself as the Messiah, the Savior. And so when they trusted him, they thought it would pull everything together, and their lives began to be very difficult. There was persecution, there was people who would no longer visit their businesses or support them, a lot of persecution, a lot of being disowned, a lot of being just pain and suffering that came with that following Christ. And so there was a group of people, Hebrew people, that wanted to go back to that system, thinking if they could do that, it would fix everything. And the writer of Hebrews is saying, that's impossible. Can I go back? And so he's been laying out the case of why. One of the things that we've been looking at is the idea that the Old Testament is a shadow. That the law, especially the sacrificial laws are shadows. The tabernacle, the temple, they're shadows. They're not even real in a sense that the real one is in heaven. And so they're a shadow of that heavenly tabernacle. They're a shadow of that heavenly temple, that holy of holies, the presence of God. And so even though they had to follow these rules upon the earth, they had to do it because if they didn't, God's option was, well, then you've got to die because there is sin. And sin is so serious, it's such an offense, that it requires the blood of the innocent to cover it. And so if they didn't do that, they would, the penalties were great. And so we see that throughout the Old Testament. And so the New Testament was a shadow, or the Old Testament was a shadow of the New Testament. The writer here takes it one step further. He says that he's leading us to understand that New Testament reality, New Testament truth, New Testament theology, the shadow can be seen in the Old Testament. There's an older commentator who said that you can cut the Bible anywhere and it would bleed the blood of Christ. That is that shadow. There's another commentator that said any New Testament truth can be seen, its shadow can be seen in the Old Testament. And so any truth that we see in the New Testament is pictured, is in a type, is there. And so it's an interesting thought. It's an interesting thing to kind of put together. Why I say that is because right off in verse 1 it says, the law is only a shadow. It's a shadow. It is a picture of what is real. It casts a shadow. And let me put it this way. Shadows can be great because we kind of see what's coming. Okay, so it allows us to see what we can't see clearly when something is casting a shadow, because it hasn't come into view for some reason. Years ago, I was hunting, and we, of course, would get up pretty early. Rick would always say, oh, you're burning daylight, you know, if you didn't get up there before dawn. So you get up there and climb up in your tree, and as the sun came up, it would begin to cast shadows. And those shadows could be, okay, there's something over there, or, you know, there's a big tree, or whatever. Sometimes your mind would play tricks on you and say, oh, look at that, that's a huge buck. And as that sun kept coming up, and you kept looking at that, and looking at that, and looking at that, and you'd think, how come this buck doesn't move? He's huge, I can see his horns, I can make out, he's laying there, I can see him. And after hunting all day long, in that tree stand, watching that huge buck, you'd climb down out of the tree and walk over there to see what it was, and it's just a bush and a log. Okay, the shadows can play tricks. It's not the shadow, actually, it's our minds. We see what we want to see in those shadows. Last night we had the TV on, and the Despicable Me 3 was on. And it's where his little girl Agnes wants to find a unicorn. And so he grew, and his brother go off on a crime deal, and this little girl goes out in the woods and tries to find a unicorn. And what she finds is a goat with one horn. And so she just is wild about it and thinks it's a unicorn, talks about it like a unicorn, brings it back, and towards the end of the movie, or when they're getting ready to leave, he's talking to this little girl with a goat, and he says, Agnes, you know it's not a unicorn. And he says, sometimes we think we have a unicorn, and it's just a goat. The truth of the New Testament explains the shadows in the Old Testament. We need them both. We need the shadow, we need those stories, we need those types, we need that picture, so that when we go to the New Testament, it's not, what are you talking about? It's, oh, that's what it is. That's the reality. The New Testament is the reality of what is pictured in the Old Testament, and that's what that means. Hebrews 10:1 says, the law was only a shadow of the good things that are coming. The law, the Old Testament, the Torah, the sacrificial laws, all that stuff, he said, is a shadow of not just the tabernacle, not just those sacrifices that happened in heaven. It is a shadow, it is a picture, it is a type of good things. Now, the good things there means pragmatic. It means practical, logical things. Things that would follow logic. The right things. It's like, oh, why have I been using this old hammer that I keep hitting my thumb with when I have this air or electric nailer that I can just go bang, 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 bang. It's practical. It's logical that you would use that, instead of sending nails all over because you're not hitting it straight and they go flying. Okay, it's pragmatic. There was a shadow of what was going to be real, what was going to be better, what was going to be obviously the right thing. Okay? And he goes on and says that they're a shadow of the good things that are coming, not the realities themselves. In other words, they were just shadows. They were just the Old Testament law, just shadows, pictures. They were there, they had reasons. God has his reasons for putting them there, which he shares with us. But the reality, the fulfillment, is in the New Testament. Okay? All right. He says, for this reason, it can never by the same sacrifices, repeat endlessly year after year, make perfect, now remember the word perfect, which means, another word might be completed, finished. It can never finish. It can never be done. It can never be perfect. Okay, so year after year, it was repeated endlessly. Now that he's talking about the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement had to be repeated every year. Every year, the Israelites, they would come out, they would do their special cleansing. They would wait until someone would gather around the tabernacle or the temple, and they would wait as the priest, the high priest, would get up, and he would, they would offer the sacrifice, and he would take the blood from that, and he would go in, and after sprinkling everything in the holy place, in the altar, the everything, candlestick, everything had to be sprinkled, everything had to be sanctified by blood. And then he would take it with his fingertip, and he would step into the Holy of Holies, and he would offer sacrifice for himself and for his family. And then he would come back out, and he would do it again. He would put his finger in, and he would offer a sacrifice on the altar, the mercy seat, for the people of Israel, for the believers. And he would offer that once a year, every year, year after year after year after year after year, from Moses until Jesus died. Thousands of years. Now, wouldn't you think that after, a couple hundred maybe years, maybe a few decades of doing this, and you have to keep doing it, you would begin to wonder, there has to be a better way. People of Israel gathered around, and they held their breath, waiting for that high priest to step back out. You know what they used to do? They used to tie a cord to his ankle. And so if he went in to offer, into the Holy of Holies to offer sacrifice, and then come step right back out, they'd drag him out of there, especially if they heard a loud bump. Out he would come. You're not going in there after it. Something went wrong. We got to figure it out. We got to talk to God. We got to get an answer before anybody else would dare go in there. It was an awkward place to be because you knew that you were a sinner when you went in there. That's why he had to offer for himself first. That's why he was in there to begin with, because of sin. Okay? Now he said, year after year, they had to do it. They had to keep doing it. And it says those who want to draw near to worship. You want to draw near to God? It's not through the sacrifice. Can't draw near to God through the sacrifice. Never happened. Through the sacrifice was just a covering of sin for that year. It was never complete. It was never finished. It was always there. It was always in front of them. It was always a barrier. You couldn't go into the holy place. You couldn't go into the Holy of Holies. You stayed back. That's not drawing near to God. Something else had to happen. Something else had to take place so God could bring us near. Okay? It's just a picture. Remember, it was a shadow. Verse 2. It says, if it could, would they not have stopped being offered? If it were possible, if it were available, wouldn't you say, okay, I'm of age now, I'm 12, I can go to the temple with my sacrifice. At that point, they go in and they offer for my sin, and it's done. I don't ever have to do it again. Wouldn't that be great? You couldn't even do that. You couldn't even do that much. It could cover you for 1 year. 1 year you had to be back there. And in the meantime, when you messed messed up, you would go to the temple and you would offer sacrifices. You'd have to go through cleansing, purification rituals. You would have to do all this thing, and you had these priests walking around in their robes and sprinkled with blood, and you had this whole deal going on all the time. It was forever in your face. He says, if it could, would they not have stopped offering? For the worshipers would have been cleansed once for all. If this thing was really real and right and good and perfect, it would be done, one and done. So it'd be once for all. And would no longer have felt guilty for their sins. Okay, that's not just guilt. Sometimes we feel guilty anyway. That's not just guilt. That is an internal problem. That is a spiritual problem. That's a problem with our heart and our minds. That's a problem that affects our soul. It affects our inside. The law and the sacrifice had no effect in here. It covered. That's all it could offer. It covered for a year. That's what atonement means. Atonement means cover. Okay? It's like Adam and Eve, and they're covered. It's the same kind of thing. It just covered. Okay? It couldn't make them guiltless. Verse 3. But those sacrifices are an annual reminder of sins. Because it is impossible for the blood, get this right, it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. It's impossible. It's impossible. You could wake up one day as an Old Testament believer and say, from now on, for the rest of my life, I'm going to live a perfect life. I'm not going to sin anymore. You still got to go to you would still have to go offer sacrifice once a year. And it would just offer you a covering. Every year is a reminder. Our sin is serious before God. And what does God say? The payment of sin is death. And so the innocent, not the guilty, not the sinful, their blood, their life has to be given for the guilty. The guiltless, the innocent for the guilty. That's what had to happen. It is a constant reminder. It was a reminder every day. It was a reminder all the time. It was guilt, guilt, guilt because of sin, sin, sin. And all it could do was cover it before God. There was no salvation. There was no... How are we saved today? For by grace are you saved through faith. It is not of yourselves. It is the... What's that word? Gift of God. Our salvation is a gift of God. There's nothing we can do to earn our salvation, to earn God's favor. We can't. We can't be religious enough. We can't be kind enough to other people. We can't be faithful enough. We can't be, to cut a deal with God, it would be ridiculous. Because it's a gift of God. Not of works. Not of works. Not of works. That's why Paul says in Galatians, for by the works of the law, no flesh has been justified. That word justified means just as if you've never sinned. Righteous, declared righteous. No one. No one could keep the law perfectly because they're still a sinner. So how did salvation come? How did the gift, what did it look like? Oh, I'm glad you asked that. Because verse 5 has that great big word that says, therefore. Therefore. Therefore, when Christ came into the world, when the Messiah came into the world, when the Savior came into the world, he said, sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you prepared for me with burnt offerings and sin offerings, you were not pleased. Then I said, here I am. It is written about me in the scroll. I have come to do your will, O God. That's an Old Testament quote. Do you think that there might be an Old Testament shadow? Where the Father would offer the Son, who was willing to lay his life down as an offering to provide salvation? Remember studying Abraham about a year ago, maybe a little more? I don't know how long we've been in Hebrews, been there a while. Remember when Abraham, after he had had Isaac, and Isaac was probably around 15, which would put Abraham about 115, and they went to the mountain, and they had the wood for the fire, they had the fire pot, they had the knife, he had Isaac, and they went up onto the mountain, and Isaac asked this question. He goes, hey Dad, I see the fire, I see the knife, I see the wood. Where's the offering? You remember what Abraham said? God will provide it. God will provide it. Now think about a 115-year-old man. Good shape for 115, but still a 115-year-old man and a 15-year-old boy. Young man. If Isaac did not want to go up that mountain, Abraham could not have made it. In as good a shape as he was, when I thought about this, I thought about my grandson who's 15. And I thought, he'll hurt you if you didn't want to do something. Okay? And the same thing is true with Abraham and Isaac. Abraham was going up there to offer his son, Isaac, when he began to realize that there was no sacrifice. I wonder when he realized that. When he laid down on the altar? When Abraham bound him? He began to put it together. I'm the sacrifice. When Abraham pulled the knife out and held it up, and God said, oh, wait a minute. That's the shadow. The shadow is that the Father was going to offer the Son, and the Son was going to be a willing, obedient Son, and end up being the sacrifice for the world. And God said, hold that, I have a ram for you. And he transferred Isaac with the ram. God provided. God provided the sacrifice. It's a gift of God that we are saved because he put his Son on the altar and he shed his blood. That's the reality. So Jesus came to do your will. Verse 8. First he said, sacrifices and offerings and burnt offerings and sin offerings. And I'm talking about the day-to-day stuff. Okay, all those things. It says, you did not desire, nor were you pleased with them. Although the law required them, they were part of the law. They were required. In order for them to commune with God, in order for them to receive the blessing of God, in order for them to walk with God, to talk with God, to have God's presence in their camp, they had to do this. Because sin separates us from God. And in the Old Testament, sin is just, it's always there, it's just covered. It's just covered. That wasn't the plan, that's the shadow. That's to get us to the next step. Verse 9 says, then he said, here am I, I have come to do your will. I've come to lay my life down in obedience to what you want. The Son is willing to go to take the place of the lambs, the bulls, our place of death. He took our death, he took our punishment, he took our wrong upon him and shed his blood and paid for it. And he did it because he was willing. So I guess some years ago, right after they did the Passover, and they had the Passover meal and went out into the garden and they prayed, and as they were praying, and Jesus had that battle with the temptation to walk away from it all. He could have called 10,000 angels to destroy the world and set him free. He could have decided, but he said, no, I'm here to do the will of my Father. He was willingly putting himself on that altar. On the altar. Pay for our sin. Pay for your sin. Pay for my sin. And he says, and by that will, we have been made holy. We, believers, followers, have been made holy through the sacrifice of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that an amazing gift? He sacrificed. Through his sacrifice, we have been, past tense, made holy. You've trusted Christ. You stand holy before God. That's your position. It's called positional sanctification. That's our position. It doesn't change. We stand before God spiritually holy. Holy. Without spot, without blemish, without sin. I'm going to have to hurry this, but it's important that I cover it. Okay, it says, verse 11, he goes, day after day, every priest stands and performs his religious duties again and again, and he offers his sacrifices which can never take away sin. They can never take them away. Okay, verse 12. But this priest had offered for all time one sacrifice for sin, sat down at the right hand of God. They had priests that would go in and out. They would offer sacrifices every day. They would, once a year, the high priest would go in and offer that sacrifice. He never sat down. He would go in, offer his sacrifice, back out. He wasn't comfortable in the holiness of God. He wasn't comfortable in that place. But this high priest, the great high priest, our high priest, went in, offered his own blood on the altar before God, and God said, you sit right here, son. You sit right here. You're done, and you watch as I make your enemies your footstool. He says, you're done. Absolutely comfortable in the presence of God. How much better could we have it? That our high priest is in the presence of the Holy Father. He's right there. We can't get it any better than that. We're there in him. Okay, that's a different lesson. We're there with him. We have access to the Father through the Son. He is the great high priest. Because he was the Holy One of God, didn't have sin, never sinned, innocent blood shed for you and shed for me. on. In verse 15 it says, since that time, he waits for his enemies to be his footstool, because by one sacrifice he has made perfect forever those who are being holy. Now this is if you're not, if you just glance at this, you go, huh? What is he talking about? We are holy, being made holy, what's going on? Positionally, we are holy. But when we got saved, there's a problem. We were dead in our trespasses and sin. Spiritually, we're dead. When Christ saved us, we became alive. He continues to make us alive in Christ. He continues to make us holy like Christ. So he's continually working in our lives, making us holy, even though positionally we are. Positionally we are holy. It's called practical sanctification. We are being cleaned up, made alive. We are understanding more. It's not just a learning process. We are growing closer and closer and closer to God. And like, I can't remember who I was telling this to, probably Ginger, I'm not sure I've said it yet, here. But in that process of being made holy and being made holy and being made holy, we can throw a wrench into the process, into the gears, and say, I'll split a deal with you, God. I'll split a deal. I'll do this good thing if you let me off the hook here. If you name it, what do you want? You know, be successful, be famous, be not have any pain, to, you know, anything we want. And we try to deal with God. You think God's up there going, man, that sounds pretty good. Hey, Michael, what do you think about that? No. We are holy, being made holy. God is working in our lives, and if we are struggling, which we all do, we are struggling, check your life, check your faith. Because in that struggle, we are probably trying to work a compromise with God. What are we doing? Going back to the law. Going back to that system. That cannot bring us close, near to God. It's failed. It's been replaced. He goes on, he says, in verse 15, and we get the benefits of this now. The benefits of the believer. It says, the Holy Spirit also testifies to us about this. First, he says, this is the covenant. Remember the word covenant, last will and testament? This is the covenant. This is the covenant. I will make with them, that's us, that's believers. After that time, he says, Lord, I will put my laws in their hearts, and I will write them on their minds. It won't be in the written law. It won't be in the, you wear it on your forehead. It won't be in the what we wear on the outside. It'll be inside. It's internal. It is a transformation of our hearts and our minds. It is something that the law could never accomplish. The law could make our wills change. For example, we're driving up Route 15 at a cool 87 miles an hour. You know, just barely breaking the speed limit. And we look up and there's the trooper setting. What happens? Sometimes you have to kick off the cruise, because that's where the cruise is at. Not that I would ever do that. Probably not when we're here. What changed? Did our minds change? Did our hearts change? What changed? The law. There's the law. That's what changed. That's what changed. As soon as he's gone, oh, phew, he pulled that other guy over. Right up the back we go. We're still a speeder. What makes us want to draw near to God? When we understand what God has done for us. He transforms our minds and our hearts. Changes our will from the inside, not from outside pressure. Look at the next phrase. He says he'll write them on our minds, so he transforms us inside and outside, and then he adds, their sins and lawless acts, what? I will remember no more. Now that's not because God's getting old and forgetful. That is, I will not remember it. It is gone. It is paid for. It is done. I refuse to remember that. It is as far as the east is from the west. It is buried in the deepest sea. They are gone. Another word for that might be forgiven. That I am forgiven. I am forgiven because of the gift of God. Because God provided. Because God satisfied that requirement of sacrifice. Because God sent His Son to the altar. Because God paid for my sin. And there are some gifts that when we are given, we can't even hardly respond. And honestly, if we look at what God has done for us, it's with a humble, broken heart. And all we can say is, thank you. I don't deserve it. I do not deserve it. But God gave it to me. That is salvation. Let's pray. Father, help us. Help us today to remember what you have done on our behalf. That we might from our hearts and our minds offer to you a wholehearted, with a full understanding, praise. Lord, that's the sacrifice you desire. Is that we would praise you from our hearts. That we would praise you from our minds. That we, knowing what you did, lift you up. And say thank you. In Jesus' name. I invite you to stand.